Okay, so before we get started with the content, I'd just like to share a bit about myself. Most of you know me already, but my name is Beth Gonzales. I'm a dietitian and on the Marin Health Cardiovascular Medicine Intensive Cardiac Rehab team. So I'm the element specialist for nutrition in that program. Um, I have actually been, I was kind of counting it up and realized time flies when you're having fun. This is actually my 14th year with Marin Health Cardiovascular Medicine programs. And it's truly been a joy and a privilege to be able to be a part of it. And especially since we've begun this lifestyle medicine programming within the cardiac rehab division. So, just super happy to be able to be a part of it and to be able to share information with you all. Just a little bit more about me, just so I can kind of explain where I started and how I ended up here. So I grew up in West Virginia, so the beautiful state of West Virginia. My hometown is Morgantown, West Virginia, and I think perhaps my mom is zooming in tonight from West Virginia. So hi, Mom. After graduating from high school, I went off to the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, where I studied nutrition and dietetics. And to become a practicing dietitian, part of that training is an internship, which I did at the University of California, San Francisco. And that's what allowed me to move out here to the Bay Area back in the early 90s. And so I became a registered dietitian, worked for a few years in a variety of settings, and then decided that I was interested in pursuing more skills around conducting research and also in more of a public health kind of space. And so I attended the University of Colorado Health Sciences Center for my Master's of Science in Public Health and worked in some more settings, and then eventually was able to move back to the Bay Area and specifically to Marin County, actually back in 2001. So I've been here for a while, and I had to put a picture of Mount Tam because it's one of my favorite places on earth in terms of being able to enjoy the trails for hiking and running and mountain biking and also running into lovely people. So that's just a bit about me. And again, this evening, our topic is going to be on the power of nutrition to prevent and manage cardiovascular disease. In terms of the topics that I will be covering this evening, we'll talk about the problem and how we got here. We'll get into the importance and impact of a healthy diet, and specifically a heart healthy diet. I'll then share food-focused guidelines for healthy hearts, and then to share some strategies and resources for eating more cardioprotective foods. So to begin with, what is the problem? So the problem is that the standard American diet truly is SAD. So it's a fitting acronym. Less than 10% of Americans actually consume a diet that's consistent with dietary guidelines for Americans. And more specifically, only 10% of Americans consume the recommended amount of vegetables, which is about 2 to 3 cups per day. Only 12% consume the recommended amount of fruit, which is about 1.5 to 2 cups per day. And this is a stat that really strikes me. Only 5% of Americans consume the recommended amount of fiber per day. So the amount of fiber depends on your calorie intake, but it ranges from about 25 to 38 grams per day. But Americans average only about 15 grams per day. And this is a big marker of how many whole foods and plant-based foods we're actually intaking. And so we're really falling short there. And it's interesting to think about kind of how our bodies evolved and reflecting on even our early ancestors' diets. And evidence shows that they ate over 100 grams of fiber per day, and some estimates are 100 to 150 grams of fiber per day. So they were clearly, the hunter and gatherers were clearly eating a lot of plants, high fiber plants, and we've moved very far away from that. Meanwhile, most Americans are over consuming salt, processed meat, red meat, added sugar, and refined grains. And so the consequences of these eating patterns are that unhealthy eating and physical activity are leading causes of death in the United States. And they've actually surpassed smoking as an underlying risk behavior leading to these cardiometabolic diseases and early death. So this unhealthy diet, physical inactivity strongly increase the risk of diseases including heart disease, high blood pressure, stroke, and type 2 diabetes. And the trends are quite troubling. More than 1 in 3 adults in the US have either prediabetes or diabetes, and nearly half of Americans have hypertension, also known as high blood pressure. Also, a really troubling trend is that in the last 3 decades, obesity rates have doubled among adults in the US, tripled among children, and quadrupled in adolescents. And so we definitely have things out of balance, and it's also important to highlight these trends that are affecting young people. Just to reiterate what Dr. Nashtala shared in his presentation, that cardiovascular disease and specifically atherosclerosis develops over decades. And so while we often, we are woken up and we get a lot of attention if something like a cardiac event happens to really affect changes in lifestyle behaviors and specifically diet, it's really so helpful and important to also be an inspiration and to model this for the young folks in your life or those who fortunately have not experienced heart disease, because it is a progressive disease, and so the fact that we're seeing these trends happening in young folks, it really is a call to arms to really take a good look at our current dietary patterns and try to improve those. So this is a slide. How did we get here? So this is multifactorial. There's a lot of factors that have led to this epidemic of cardiometabolic diseases in our society, but just to highlight a few, this first upper left is just the idea of our sedentary lifestyle. So we spend a lot more time both through work and through leisure activities on screens and not moving our bodies. And so it takes like real intention to be physically active in the way our bodies were really designed to. Matt Hun, our exercise physiologist, will dive deep into this topic of physical activity and exercise for his lecture as part of the series, but it's definitely a key factor that's led to this problem of where we are now. Just below that is an image of these hyper palatable, highly processed foods that have really flooded our eating environment. And so these foods are very convenient to get. They tend to be less expensive than healthier foods. And they are very high in what we call these hyper palatable things. They taste really good. They're high in salt, they're high in sugar, they're high in fats. But unfortunately, they're also very high in calories without very much nutrition along the way. So eating a lot of these, or these being a part of our kind of, again, strongly a part of our eating environment, means we're either not eating enough of the good stuff or we're eating just too much overall. And so that's a factor also, a significant factor in the shift in our eating habits and why only 10% of Americans are meeting guidelines. I also have this image of what we call portion distortion. So over the past 2 to 3 decades, portions have gotten much bigger. The whole idea of supersizing, where you get more food for your money if you go bigger, has not served our health at all. And so just important to keep in mind that just because a restaurant serving is a very large portion, it doesn't necessarily mean that's the right portion that we should be eating. So we're really affected by a lot of these different environmental things that make it tough to stay on a healthy lifestyle pattern, but we certainly can do it, and it's important to recognize how we got here. And this bottom right slide just is this image of this person looking confused and probably very frustrated by just the immense amount of different information, often what feels contradictory, often misinformation about what is the healthiest, best way to eat. And so I just really want to make the point that detractors that say things like everything we ever knew about how to eat healthy is wrong, I mean, that's a big red flag that that's very likely going to be misleading information, because we do have a large and growing body of evidence around diet and health, and we have a really good idea of the healthiest way we should be eating. Science and evidence absolutely evolves, and we learn more along the way. But and we do, you know, make some adjustments along the way. But the base of what we understand is the healthiest way to eat is quite clear, based on the totality of the evidence coming from so many different studies, epidemiologically, cohort studies, and controlled studies. And so we have guidelines, dietary guidelines from peer-reviewed consensus panels that we can turn to and rely on, rather than maybe being swept up with information that is a best-selling book or by somebody who's selling various supplements or something to make money and telling you everything you've been doing is wrong, or other fad diets. And so that's a really important point as well. And I hope you'll look to our cardiac rehab program and services and myself and the other dietitians as a reliable source of information around the healthiest way to eat. So I would just say the solution is, to quote Hippocrates' wisdom from many years ago, let food be thy medicine, because choosing the right foods really is incredibly powerful in terms of preventing, managing, and even reversing disease. And so food truly can be medicine, and we actually can see healing and reversal happen quite quickly. And so when we think about some of the evidence around the support of the eating patterns that we recommend, and I'll get to those in more detail in a moment, but I'd like to just highlight the blue zones, which are known as these longevity hotspots. And so many of you may be familiar with this. There was actually a Netflix series, docuseries out just in these past few months that was called Live to 100, The Secrets of the Blue Zones. And these blue zones are known for really being excellent at not just improving and increasing lifespan, but increasing health span. So Dr. Nishala talked about that our goal is to live longer and live better and increase health span. And we can look to communities around the world who are really doing an excellent job at that. And so the 5 areas of the world that have been identified as these longevity hotspots or blue zones include Sardinia, Italy, Okinawa, Japan, Nicoya, Costa Rica, Icaria, Greece, and Loma Linda, California. And so clearly this is a diverse list. These are different parts of the world, different cultures, different foods available, but the folks who have spent a lot of time studying these communities have learned that there are some consistent themes among them. And I won't go into a lot of detail, but some of the big themes are they are very physically active, they have social connectivity, and of course, their diet is a key part of this theme of living healthy lifestyles. They eat about 95% plant-based. So they're not necessarily 100% plant-based, but they're predominantly whole food plant-based. So you can bet their fiber intake is way up there. And in terms of the 5 to 10% animal-based proteins, it varies depending on the region. But the key is that it's a very small proportion of their diet. Excuse me, I take a little swig of water. So also building on evidence, so that would be an example of epidemiological evidence in support of plant-predominant eating patterns. But we also know, and you're all familiar, especially if you have been in the Ornish reversal program with us, this idea of very low-fat, plant-based eating patterns. And so I'm showing this image that comes from Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn out of the Cleveland Clinic, and actually Dr. Nishala showed this as well because it's quite compelling. This shows LAD, or left anterior descending coronary artery, at baseline, and then after this person followed this low-fat whole plant-based diet, in just 3 years, they had their artery opened up, and this was without using medication. This was just simply a lifestyle intervention. And it's interesting because in terms of how this pattern was designed, as well as being Ornish, um, Dr. Esselstyn actually studied folks in parts of the world like Central Africa and parts of Asia and New Guinea where heart disease was actually almost non-existent. And so you can ask, is it all genetics, or might there be something else? And in his research, he found that they were eating basically very low fat, plant-based, very high fiber diets. And again, the idea of heart disease, which is the #1 killer in the US and in westernized countries in general, that they didn't have any heart disease. And so that's what led to this design of this particular eating pattern. And they did, in fact, have very impressive results. But building, again, we have a preponderance of evidence from different types of trials. We also have these major these trials that were also randomized controlled for what we call secondary prevention. So just like with Ornish and Esselstyn, these are folks who have had existing heart disease or already had a cardiac event. And so we call this secondary prevention, with the idea of lowering risk for a secondary event. So these two trials both actually looked at a Mediterranean style eating pattern, which is also plant predominant, but not 100% plant-based. It is low in saturated fat, but actually higher in the unsaturated fats, particularly from nuts and seeds and olive oil. And each of these different large cohort studies found that that basically, like in the first one, the Lion Diet Heart Study, over the 27-month period, the Mediterranean diet group experienced 70% fewer cardiac events compared to the control diet, which was more in line with like the SAD kind of typical American diet, which would have more saturated fat, meat, and refined grains. And also the Predimed trial, which I believe Dr. Nichelle also referenced, but over the 5 years of the trial, the folks following the plant predominant Mediterranean diet were 41% less likely to die during the 5-year period. And so, this is just more compelling evidence pointing towards these plant predominant patterns. So as I mentioned, we do have peer-reviewed consensus guidelines that review the quality of evidence and make determinations about what guidelines are recommended, both for the general public and also for folks who are trying to prevent, like with secondary prevention. So the American Heart Association has guidelines that emphasize these minimally processed whole plant foods like your fruits and vegetables and whole grains. For their healthy sources of protein, they highlight fish and seafood, legumes and nuts, and then low-fat or fat-free dairy, and poultry, and if desired, lean meat, but in small amounts, and also the more unsaturated types of oils coming from plants. They also recommend minimizing beverages and foods with added sugar and the ultra-processed foods, as well as foods high in salt, alcoholic beverages, and tropical oils, and to do this all within an energy intake to help achieve and maintain a healthy body weight. So those are the AHA guidelines. But the AHA guidelines, along with other organizations like the American College of Cardiology, emphasize a variety of patterns they recommend a variety of patterns that emphasize plants. And so they're a little more flexible around kind of what's considered heart healthy, but all of these patterns are very plant strong, high fiber, low in saturated fat. But I do want to name some of these specifically because you may be interested in learning more or following some of these patterns. They're all, you can find information online, especially about the first three. So the DASH diet, or dietary approaches to stop hypertension, is an eating pattern that is very high in fruits and vegetables. So it's high in potassium, and it's low in saturated fats. It does have an optional allowance for some animal protein, but the lower saturated fat animal proteins like fish or skinless poultry primarily, but it really recommends limiting the portions of those to no more than 4 to 6 ounces a day in the context of an overall very plant predominant diet. Next, I mentioned the portfolio diet. This is a diet that was devised basically to target lowering LDL cholesterol. It was developed by Dr. Jenkins, excuse me, out of the University of Toronto, and has been shown to be very effective, kind of going at functional foods aimed at lowering LDL cholesterol, which will lower cardiovascular disease risk. And I will be sharing some specifics of both of these patterns in my food-based guidelines in just a bit. The Mediterranean style pattern, as I highlighted from those two studies that showed really much preferred hard outcomes compared to a standard diet. So again, Mediterranean patterns, they vary depending on which region along the Mediterranean Sea these countries are, but what they have in common is a lot of plants, not very much animal protein, as well as whole grains and beans and nuts and seeds. And then lastly, I mentioned healthy, emphasizing the word healthy. Vegetarian and vegan diets also can be referred to as whole food plant-based. And so that would include, for example, the Ornish pattern that we follow with the intensive cardiac rehab program, but also the ACLM, American College of Lifestyle Medicine, and Forks Over Knives. They encourage a whole food plant-based eating pattern. So when you think of whole food plant-based, it would be an emphasis on foods in their whole form rather than processed. So for example, getting fats from nuts and seeds and avocado rather than oils. So I wanted to, as just wrapping up some of this evidence I wanted to share, I wanted to include this study that was just published just this month that wanted to look at the question of the benefit of a vegan diet versus more of a flexitarian diet versus an omnivore diet. Because often the question comes up, like, I really want to do all that I can do. Is it an all or nothing prospect? If I don't follow 100% like a whole food plant-based pattern, am I going to have no benefit? And so, I think that we can speak to that to say, one thing is for sure, we don't have a head-to-head study of like an Ornish style low-fat plant-based versus like a Mediterranean style. We don't have that head-to-head, but we do have data to suggest that the more plant-based, including more fiber and the less animal protein, outcomes tend to be better. But it is a continuum, and so it's not an all or nothing situation. This study does a nice job of kind of looking at cutoffs around that question. So this was a study of healthy participants, and they compared the vegan pattern, which meant no animal protein, and it was a healthy vegan pattern, not a junk food vegan pattern, comparing to a flexitarian pattern, which is mostly plant-based, but would average no more than 1.75 ounces of animal protein per day. So if you want to kind of visually think of that, a deck of cards is about 3 ounces. So it would be just a little more than half of a deck of cards per day on average. So that might mean those folks were eating all plant-based except for some animal protein some of the days of the week, or very small portions. And they tended to go for more fish and chicken and less red meat or processed meat. Versus the omnivore pattern in this study, these folks were eating at least 6 ounces of animal protein per day. And they did tend to eat more of red meat, and they kind of tended to eat more of all of it. So they had fish and chicken, but they had especially higher amounts of red meat and processed meats than the flexitarians. And so the results showed that vegans and flexitarians had better levels of insulin, triglycerides, total and LDL, which is the bad type of cholesterol, compared to the omnivores. So both did better. And actually the vegans had the most favorable overall results. And so again, the take home is, I think most of the evidence suggests that the more you go into it, the deeper you go in with plant-based, whole food plant-based, generally the results tend to be better in terms of protection against cardiometabolic diseases, but it's not an all or nothing prospect. It doesn't have to be perfect to get really significant improvements. And so I think that's a key thing to highlight. I also just want to add that the idea of focusing on these cardioprotective foods rather than just thinking about, oh, I can't have this, but rather to emphasize this is what I really am going to try to incorporate, has an effect of crowding out or replacing foods that are linked to cardiovascular disease. So if we really think about incorporating our daily goals around whole grains, fruits and vegetables, legumes, et cetera, then we will crowd out and push out these foods that are more consistent with the standard American diet. So that's been shown to be true, and it's a kind of a psychological thing to think not so much what I can't eat, but what should I be eating? And so in terms of what should I be eating, this is a nice plate showing an example of cardioprotective foods and key elements of a healthful plant-based eating pattern. So this is a plate showing half of it being filled with produce, so primarily the vegetables and some fruit. The drink of choice is water, and then for plant-based proteins, that would include a variety of beans, peas, lentils, chickpeas, edamame, tofu, tempeh, quinoa, nuts, and seeds. These are all examples of plant foods that have high amounts of protein. But by the way, all plant foods have protein. So it's the variety of foods that will help achieve those goals. I'll speak a little bit more about that in a bit. But about a quarter of the plate focusing on a good plant-based protein. The fats coming from plants, which are primarily unsaturated fatty acids like your nuts and seeds, avocado, and then plant oils that are primarily unsaturated. So not the solid stuff like coconut oil or palm oil or lard or butter, but rather the unsaturated, more liquid fats. And then about a quarter of this plate are your whole grains, or it could be starchy vegetables similarly, but whole grains, including a variety of whole grains like brown rice, oats, quinoa, barley, whole wheat, wild rice, millet, farro, and bulgur and corn all count as whole grains. So lock in that image of a healthy plate, and that will really help you get to those targets that we're talking about and really get that fiber up. So how does this all work? How can food be medicine? It's a much more kind of mechanistic effect. It's not just the fact that it's like, oh, limit your fat to keep your cholesterol down. There's a lot more going on than that. And so when we follow this healthful plant-based pattern, we're going to get a diet that's going to be high in fiber, low in calorie density. So you can imagine a big plate of vegetables that have a lot of bulk and fiber, and visually it's a lot of food, but calorie levels low. So that's part of what you're going to get. You're going to get a healthy types of fats, so more of those unsaturated, heart healthy fats, and less of the saturated fats. You're going to get high levels of antioxidants, polyphenols, carotenoids, other beneficial micronutrients, all of these things that help protect our cells, our arteries, and control blood pressure and do all kinds of wonderful things. And again, you'll get that crowded out effect, so less of the low levels of those harmful dietary factors. And so through those food components, we get improvements in our cholesterol level, we get reduced blood pressure, it helps promote a healthier body weight, it decreases inflammation, improves vascular health, improves our gut microbial profile, so that gut microbiome gets better with eating more diverse fibers, and that has downstream benefits to around inflammation and around overall health. And so all very key mechanisms. And then also this eating pattern enhances glycemic control, meaning it allows you to have better blood sugar control. And the net effect is reduced cardiovascular risk. So there's a lot of good stuff going on when you eat a lot of plants. Really important to highlight that not all plants are, that plant-based or vegan doesn't always mean better or healthier. And this is, it's kind of obvious that if you just eat French fries and cupcakes and soda, even though that could be vegan, it's not going to be healthy. However, this has even been looked at through the Nurses Health Study and Health Professionals Follow-Up Study, which is a huge cohort of folks where you follow dietary patterns and various health outcomes. And lo and behold, the results are that a healthy plant-based diet is associated with substantially lower rates of coronary heart disease. However, if you're following an unhealthy plant-based diet, it actually is associated with increased risk. And a really key point here is that replacement matters tremendously. So if somebody, for example, says, oh, I'm cutting out meat, but then they suddenly are just eating a lot of refined grains and sugars and highly processed foods, it's really not going to have any benefit health-wise. Also, if you're, just cutting out fats, but you're eating a bunch of refined fat-free carbohydrates and sugars, that's not going to help. So that's just an important point. And it's also sometimes data gets presented where they haven't done a fair example of what's being replaced in changes in diet. So that's really important to keep in mind. Okay, so now we're going to move into some practical guidelines and food-focused guidelines for healthy hearts. And the first thing I want to, since I keep talking so much about fiber, this will be my first point. So including foods rich in viscous fiber. So viscous fiber is another word for soluble fiber. It's especially effective at helping reduce cholesterol levels and specifically the LDL or bad type of cholesterol. And this is because it actually blocks the absorption of cholesterol from your gut into your bloodstream. It binds with bile acids, so it forces you to pull cholesterol out of the pool. And it also fuels healthy bacteria in the gut that also has metabolic advantages by having more of a healthy gut microbiome. And in effect, lowers inflammation and helps improve blood sugar. So fiber is awesome. And there's a combination of both insoluble and soluble fiber. And so when you eat a variety of plant foods, you'll get both. But viscous fibers specifically are key for lowering cholesterol. So how can we get there? So just think about some of these strategies. Aim to include at least a cup a day of beans, lentils, or other or chickpeas, or kind of a variety of other beans, peas, or lentils. Eat at least 5 servings of vegetables and fruit each day, and some of these that are particularly high in soluble or viscous fiber include eggplant, okra, apples, berries, and oranges. Aim for at least 1 cup per day of whole grain that's rich in this viscous fiber, such as oatmeal, barley, oat bran, or even just using psyllium husk like Metamucil. Even that has that viscous fiber, and that counts. And then just replacing refined grains with whole grains is key. And the portfolio diet study found that LDL cholesterol decreased by 5 to 10% with 20 grams of viscous fiber per day. And that can even be a more powerful effect. And we can even see it with 10 grams of viscous fiber. But important to incorporate those foods. And, on the topic of eating, aiming high for fruits and vegetables, a high intake of fruits and vegetables will also help lower blood pressure because it's rich in potassium. It actually helps offset the effects of sodium. And this is a big component of that DASH diet pattern that I shared. So aim for at least 3 cups of veggies. Ideally go for, include some leafy greens, some cruciferous, go for a nice rainbow of color. Eat 2 to 3 cups of fruit every day. And blues and purples in particular are heart and brain healthy. So finding ways to include those every day is key. I just list out some different ways to work in lots of veggies. If you're thinking, well, I've always known all my life, I've been told to eat more veggies, but how can I actually operationalize that? So think about, instead of eggs, cheese and ham omelets, you could go for an egg white scramble or a tofu scramble with sauteed onions, mushrooms, tomatoes, and spinach. You can think about having a big salad as one of your base meals most days, and add lots of other plant foods like beans and nuts and seeds, and hard healthy types of dressings, or just a squeeze of lemon, perhaps a baked potato on the side, rounds out a beautiful meal. I list roasted veggies because if you get tired of kind of eating a lot of salads, or you're looking for something a little more warm or just different type of flavor in your veggies, super easy to prepare roasted veggies. Just preheat your oven to 425, get your whatever kind of veggies you enjoy, cut them in uniform size, and just mix with 1 to 2 teaspoons of olive oil, or even just a spray of olive oil. And then you can season it with just a little bit of salt and pepper, or you might use things like sage, rosemary, or thyme to season it. And so super easy and so good. You can think about making veggie stir fries, and think about maybe tofu instead of the animal protein in your stir fry. And then, of course, soups and stews and casseroles are great opportunities to add lots of veggies. This is a slide that is emphasizing the importance of a whole grain over a refined grain. And basically, whole grain means that it includes the outer layer, which is the bran, and the germ, which is the nutrient-packed core. And when grains go from whole to refined, a lot of the nutrients are removed. And so, really encourage as much as possible to go for whole grain over the white refined stuff. And there are many examples of whole grains. I won't read them all here. I listed some in that earlier image of the plate. But this slide is just to say, if you are somebody that has to avoid gluten because of celiac disease or gluten sensitivity, there are lots of options of whole grains that are gluten-free. And so, gluten basically is just in wheat, rye, and barley. So all the other ones are free and clear and great options for whole grains. I list this as a quick win. If you're sort of thinking, well, where do I even get started? And it feels overwhelming or daunting sometimes to think about moving towards this cardioprotective eating pattern. I often encourage folks, just start with your first meal of the day, think about breakfast, and think about oatmeal. Oatmeal is a great option because it is rich in that viscous fiber that we call beta-glucan. There's no added salt, there's no added sugar. It's so inexpensive and easy to make. And within just a few weeks, you can see a lowering of your cholesterol. You can also boost a bowl of oatmeal in terms of taste and nutrition by adding some fruit, add some nuts and seeds. So this is just, again, kind of what I would consider a quick win. How about breads? And how do we think about those? So breads are counted as a grain. And obviously it could be a refined grain or it could be a whole grain. It is going to be more processed than those intact whole grains, but they do count in your kind of targets around including whole grains in your eating pattern. But do look for 100% whole wheat or whole as the first ingredient in the list. And you should get, at least 3 grams of fiber per slice of bread. Be aware of the sodium content because a lot of breads are high in sodium. So you want to make sure you're not going over about 120 milligrams. You can find bread with no added salt as low as 5 or 10 milligrams. But just be aware of the higher sodium ones and make sure that those fit in your diet if you are eating those. I mentioned the flourless sprouted options such as Ezekiel as a great bread option because these sprouted grains they actually do have more available nutrients, including some B vitamins, iron, vitamin C, minerals, and protein. And they are lower in starch, so they are better for blood sugar control. So think about those sprouted grains like Ezekiel or Alvarado Street if you're thinking about breads. This slide is saying go nuts for nuts. We have good evidence that incorporating nuts, or if not able to eat nuts, at least to think about seeds in your daily eating pattern. And a little bit goes a long way because nuts are very calorie dense, but they're very nutritionally dense. So 1 to 2 ounces or about a handful per day is a good target. A variety of nuts are wonderful, including almonds and walnuts. Peanuts are actually legumes, but they have the same kind of benefit and property as nuts, and they're a little bit higher in protein than the other ones. Pistachios, cashews, and hazelnuts, all great choices, all loaded in vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, and heart-healthy fats. And the data on nuts does show us that just this consumption of 1 to 2 ounces per day most days of the week is associated with a 5 to 10% reduction in that LDL or bad cholesterol, and it decreases risk of atrial fibrillation and stroke, and is associated with a 25% reduction in risk of death from heart disease. So that's pretty powerful. It was this kind of data that led Dr. Ornish to evolve his reversal guidelines from having no nuts and seeds to actually encouraging a small amount of nuts and seeds every day. It's important to pay attention to sodium, and this is one of those foods that are overconsumed in the typical American diet. Americans consume an average of 3,400 milligrams of sodium per day, and this is associated with high blood pressure, with risk of developing high blood pressure. And another deal on sodium is that it is a key ingredient in those highly palatable foods, and so it is prone to overindulging. So if you remember those ads for, I think it was Lay's potato chips, you can't eat just one. They were really onto something, and the food industry is really onto something because sodium is, as I said, highly palatable, and it's tough to gauge kind of true appetite regulation with some of these hyperpalatable foods. So being aware of sodium in foods is key. The guidelines for Americans recommends limiting sodium to 2,300 milligrams per day. And if you're at high risk for hypertension, then the recommendation is to limit it to 1,500 milligrams per day. It's important to keep in mind that most of the sodium in our diets comes from sodium added by others. So either in processed foods or prepared foods, these account for over 75% of the sodium that is typically consumed. But it is important to be mindful of the salt that we add ourselves, because just a teaspoon of table salt has over 2,300 milligrams, or again, the recommended limit per day. So some tips to skim the sodium. Cooking real food at home it will serve us very well. So just the more we can do that, the more control we're going to have of what we're eating. In the case of buying packaged foods, the food labels are very helpful just to understand the amount of sodium we're getting. Be aware of surprising sources of sodium, including bread, which is the #1 source of sodium in the American diet, which I was surprised to learn. Salsa, salad dressing, marinades, condiments, cottage cheese, and soups are all high sources of sodium. Push the fruits and veggies because they're naturally low in sodium and they have that potassium to help offset the effects of sodium. And then just also be aware that processed, smoked, and cured meats, as well as processed plant-based meats, can often be very high in sodium. And so you just want to pay attention to that, especially if you're moving more towards these plant-based alternatives. There's some great options, but many of them are high in sodium. So you just want to know and choose the better alternatives. And then also restaurant websites do often, especially the bigger chains, will offer nutrition information, so you can check out sodium content of foods there. Check out your nutrition facts labels. And so when you scroll on down, you'll see sodium is listed. In this example, it says 160 milligrams in this 2/3 cup portion. So just keeping in mind that your daily sodium budget should fall somewhere around 2,000 milligrams a day. And so how does that fit? It doesn't mean we can't add any sodium, but if you think about a typical meal, trying to stay no more than about 600 to 700 milligrams, that's generally a good target to aim for. And so that's just helpful to keep that in mind and read your labels and look for the items that are lower in sodium than others. And then moving on to another important ingredient to be mindful of and to limit: added sugar. So too much added sugar is linked to increased risk for heart attack and stroke. And the top sources of the top sources of added sugar are sweetened beverages and sweet bakery products. But as I think sugar is added to so many processed foods. It's, again, one of those hyperpalatable foods. And so it can slip in there insidiously, especially in things like sweetened yogurts and protein bars and boxed cereal, but it's also in all kinds of foods. I think sugar is on every item in the menu at McDonald's, at least it used to be. So it's just important to be aware. And again, some sugar can fit in and have its place, but there are limits. So the American Heart Association recommends a maximum of 9 teaspoons, which is about 36 grams of added sugar for men, and 6 teaspoons or 25 grams for women. And that's just based on kind of a proportion of calories, because women tend to eat less calories than men. And so that's where that comes from. And so again, labels will tell us the amount of added sugar. And so if you scan your nutrition facts label under carbohydrate, you'll find fiber. So we want to see a lot of fiber, and then you'll see total sugars. The total sugars will include both natural sugars like from fruit and the lactose in milk. And then specifically, we're talking here about added sugars, and you'll see your grams of added sugar. So this product, 2/3 of a cup, has 10 grams of added sugar. So it's already nearly half or a third of the total allowance of the day. So you just want to be aware of that. Next, I want to address alcohol and heart health. So excessive alcohol or excessive drinking of alcohol can lead to high blood pressure, to cardiomyopathy, arrhythmias, fatty liver, and elevated triglycerides, which is a fat in your blood, as well as excess body weight. The guidelines around alcohol consumption are beginning to change some. The American Heart Association continues to recommend that you do not start drinking if you don't already, but if you do drink, to limit to no more than 2 drinks per day for men and 1 drink per day for women. But based on emerging evidence that's pointing to abstinence being the healthiest choice and that less is better, Canada has released new 2024 guidance on alcohol and health and defines low risk moderate consumption as no more than 2 drinks per week. And so in terms of what we consider a serving size, it's generally 12 ounces of beer, but be aware some of the higher alcohol content beers like IPAs, that's more than 1 serving, 4 to 5 ounces of wine or 1.5 ounces of 80 proof liquor. So important to be mindful of that as well. And then just want to hit on a couple more topics here as we enter the home stretch. Focusing on healthy sources of protein, mostly from plants. So I made the point earlier that all whole plant foods contain actually all of the amino acids. They're just coming in varying amounts. And so when we refer to these plant proteins that have a higher proportion of protein, these include beans and lentils and peas, soybeans and tofu, edamame, tempeh. Seitan is mentioned, which is a kind of a concentrated gluten that you can either buy or you can make yourself. Whole grains, nuts, and seeds. And also the fruits and vegetables also do contain protein. So eating a variety is key. And if you are including some dairy, go for unsweetened, low-fat or non-fat dairy, and especially like the Greek yogurts or the Icelandic yogurts have higher, like double the amount of protein and half the amount of sugar. So those are really good choices. If you are including some animal proteins and as recommended in small amounts, the recommendation would be to go for fish or skinless poultry and egg whites. And some eggs can also fit in. The deal on whole eggs has to do with the egg yolk, which is very high in dietary cholesterol. And the impact on whole eggs on health varies among individuals. So some folks absorb a lot of the cholesterol and others less, but the data does point towards greater egg consumption being associated with increased cardiovascular disease risk. Therefore, a prudent guideline is to limit whole egg consumption to no more than about 1 egg per day. For some, even less is better, and others, a little bit more can be tolerated without an effect on cholesterol level, but that's kind of the nuanced recommendation around eggs. In terms of dietary fats and heart health, I've mentioned saturated fat being the one to limit. It's because it raises your LDL cholesterol and is associated with increased cardiovascular disease risk, while unsaturated fat is associated with decreased risk. And I mentioned that what you replace one nutrient with another is so critical. So if you replace saturated fat with refined grains, you don't get any improved risk for health, any improved decreased risk of heart disease. But if you replace just 5% of calories from saturated fat with the polyunsaturated fats, heart disease risk is decreased by 42%. So that's a really key point here. So the unsaturated fats are specifically your polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fats coming from nuts, seeds, avocado, and your non-tropical plant oils and fatty fish. And so limiting saturated fat, foods that are high in saturated fat would be thinking about limiting or avoiding butter, lard, full fat dairy and cheese, beef, pork, processed meats, poultry, whole eggs, coconut, and palm oil. And also important to note that all fats are high in calories. So for weight management, portion control is important. So in the final points here, looking at strategies for eating more plants, there's just some practical tips around how do we operationalize these guidelines. So stock a plant-based pantry. So load up your refrigerator with fruits and veggies to make the healthy choice the easy choice. So, and prepping your veggies or buying pre-washed and chopped veggies so that they're always ready to eat is a great incentive to eat more of those and just make life easier for yourself. Think about batch cooking. So prepare big batches of grains and beans for multiple days. And they can keep in the refrigerator for days or in the freezer indefinitely. You can also stock up on items like canned beans and canned tomatoes. You think about adding your grains and beans to salads and soups and stir fries and grain bowls. Really the idea of just get cooking. So just build confidence and make your life easier in terms of having control of what you're eating by planning for at least one night a week to try a plant-based recipe. And just think about your soups and stews and stir fries and casseroles because they make great leftovers. So one cook can go for 2 to 3 meals, right? One preparation. And then keeping it simple. So meatless meals can be as easy as a black bean burrito, a veggie burger, vegetarian chili, or just a sandwich with hummus and veggies on a whole grain bread or pita. Also just thinking about taking inspiration from different vegetarian ethnic cuisines. Many cultures for hundreds of years have mastered the balance of flavorful vegetables, herbs, spices, and sauces. So you can look to African, Asian, Latin American, Mediterranean, and Middle Eastern restaurants and recipes to inspire plant-based meals. Think about just converting your favorite dishes. So you can start with your favorite dishes and think about simple swaps and swapping out animal protein for beans, lentils, tofu, or tempeh. Focus on loading that plate with veggies and make that the main attraction of the meal. You might dust off your slow cooker so that you can prepare, a delicious meal at the beginning of the day with veggies and herbs and broth and canned tomatoes, whole grains and beans. Turn it on, and when you come home, a hearty, heart-healthy meal will await you. And then just the idea of swapping out dairy for plant-based milks and yogurts. Just be aware that some of those plant-based non-dairy options are high in coconut oil, and that's actually high in saturated fat. So you want to be aware of that. So the bottom line, our take-home messages. Plant-based eating patterns are linked to significant reduction in risk of cardiovascular disease and diabetes, so those cardiometabolic diseases. These benefits are mediated by improvements in your lipids, blood pressure, insulin resistance, weight, inflammation, and gut bacterial metabolites. And plant-based diets promote insulin sensitivity, allowing patients to reap numerous benefits of healthful carbohydrates. So when you go for healthy carbohydrates, you don't need to fear carbohydrates. That's how you're getting this tremendous fiber that I keep talking about. I have here some references that were used to put together this presentation, as well as some resources for encouraging more plant-based cardioprotective eating. And so there's lots of great resources out there. They're listed here, and I believe we're going to be sending out a compilation of some of these resources to you all in a later email, since it's I'm only going to be able to stay on the slide for a quick moment, but there's loads of plant strong recipe sites. I've only listed a few here, but there's so many, and so you just find the ones that you enjoy. I'm gonna, let's see, we're at almost 7 o'clock. I wanted to answer one question that came in early earlier, so I do want to do that, and then I'll let you all go. And I so appreciate all of your attention. But there was a great question that came in from Eli. So Eli, thank you for sending in this question. His question was, what specific dietary recommendations do you have for patients who are so-called cholesterol hyperproducers and hyperabsorbers? In this new age of personalized precision medicine, one-size-fits-all dietary advice seems to be on the decline. In particular, do human genetics such as ApoE test results modify any blanket recommendations of the Orange program? So it's such a great question, and it could be a whole another topic for a full lecture. But I do just want to briefly say that you're hitting on something really important, this idea of precision nutrition and cardiovascular disease risk, which uses nutrigenomics, nutrigenetics to identify individual variability in our response to diet and how it affects our risk for diseases. And so that area is definitely growing, and I'm optimistic it will allow for more tailored advice so that folks can know where to really put their emphasis. I will point out that that while our genetics have not changed, this epidemic of heart disease and diabetes and obesity has changed. So that has very much to do with the changes in our environment and factors we do have control over. However, like your point about the hyperabsorbers of cholesterol, that is a thing for sure. Probably helps explain why the data is mixed around egg consumption. And it's not, doesn't do justice to say, oh, we don't need to worry about cholesterol and its effect on our LDL cholesterol. Because for some people it really makes a big impact, and for others it's not an issue. And so that's where kind of that modest like limit to no more than 1 egg per day or perhaps less comes in. And there are tests that do measure whether you're a hyperabsorber. Another example of how that gets operationalized by your physicians or your cardiologists, some people are taking Zetia, which acts on blocking absorption of cholesterol. So that's most effective for people who hyperabsorb cholesterol, and so can be used in conjunction with a statin. So Eli, thank you for that question. And again, any other questions or comments, please email those to Max Drake. I believe he's put his email in the chat. I apologize for going a little bit over, lots of information to cover, but any of your comments and questions will help inform the next topics that I cover. And just really appreciate all of you being here and continuing our community of in this lifestyle medicine, this journey of healthy lifestyle together. So thank you so much. Have a good evening.